Hi, this is a video on how to replace your rear bearings on a E46 BMW. Mine's a 2003 330i. The first thing you need to do is obviously put your car up on jack stands and remove both rear wheels. I'm only doing the driver's side bearing. I already did the passenger and I didn't film it, so this will be a DIY on just the driver's side. So let's get started. So I need to remove the sway bar off the car. Sway bar is this piece here. So there's a bolt here that's 13 millimeters on both sides. And then there's, let's see if I can get under here. Right under there, there's two on each side. Those are 13 millimeters on the bottom. And then on the top here, see through it, the spring there, I have my wrench on it. It's a 17 millimeter. So what you do is you put your wrench on there, like fit it on there, then crawl under the car and loosen the 13 millimeter. So I'm going to do that first. Okay, so the sway bar is now off or unbolted. But in order to get it off the car, we're gonna have to lower the exhaust. Okay, in order to remove the exhaust or lower it enough so I can take the sway bar off and then do the rest of the job, we have to loosen these support brackets, and also up in the front where the muffler is, there's two film that. There we go. There's two hangers that hold the exhaust to the back of the car. So those are 13 millimeter as well. So we're going to take those off. So with the exhaust lowered, we were able to remove the sway bar, which is on the floor right there. And the next step is going to be to loosen the half shaft Torx bolts, and also loosen the big 36 millimeter nut that holds on the half shaft. So that's going to be that looks extremely rusted, so that should be fun to remove. So that will be the next step. Okay, so the next step is to remove the half shaft bolts holding it to the differential. So I've soaked them in penetrating oil, these bolts here, and I'm going to use a long socket to go in this way above the brake disc to remove them. So I'll bring the camera around the other side to see that. So this is what I'm using here. It's I don't know, 2 foot extension, and then I have a slim E14 Torx socket, and that way you can get right into the over here. You can get right into the onto the bolt easily to loosen it. So the trick here is to put a piece like a chisel or something in the fin of the brake disc to prevent it from moving back and forth, and that way you can loosen the Torx bolt, loosen one, then move the next one into the right position, lock it down, and so forth, next one. So I'm going to do that. Put one in the bottom as well. And then I'm going to use my long socket to lock onto the Torx bolt and then loosen it with a ratchet. Hopefully I won't need the breaker bar, but we'll see. There we go. There's one loose. I've removed all the half shaft bolts, so it spins freely now. So the next step will be to remove the big bolt here. Okay, so in order to remove the half shaft bolt that's bolting it to the hub, we need to they're hammered in, the edges of the bolt are hammered in to the half shaft. So we're going to need to hammer those out with a chisel, and then we'll try to take the bolt off with the impact wrench, and if not that, then the breaker bar, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so we're going to try to use the impact wrench to remove that 36mm bolt holding the half shaft onto the hub. So you need to use like I'm using a chisel here, once again to lock the brake disc so the whole assembly doesn't move. So get that in snug. And then we're going to try to remove it with the impact wrench. Okay, so we've removed the bolt. It came off with the impact wrench, and so the next step will be to remove the brake disc, the caliper, so we can get access to the hub behind the disc. Okay, now we're going to remove the brake caliper. So the first part is to remove this anti-rattle clip. So that comes off there. Okay, next we're going to remove the caliper from the caliper bracket carrier. So the first thing is to remove the little plastic caps. Then you're going to need a 7mm socket. So they should just, once they're loose, they just slide out pretty easy. That's one. This is the second one. So now you can pull the caliper off the carrier. So you can just use a screwdriver to sort of pry it out. The brake pad will fall off or come off. That's the outer pad. And there's the inner pad. So You shouldn't leave it hanging. You should use a piece of stiff wire or coat hanger to, I'm gonna hang it at the top of the, my shock absorber. Before we remove the caliper carrier, we need to remove the retaining bolt here for the disc. Because if we take this off, then this moves freely and it's harder to get this off. So that's, before we take the carrier off, we'll take the retaining bolt out. So we'll use a chisel again, stick it in the carrier so the disc doesn't move. Then we're using a 6mm hex to remove the retaining bolt. Oops. There we go. So I've taken my discs off recently, so mine's loose. But yours may. You may have to hammer it or pry it with a bar to get it loose. Now we're going to remove the caliper carrier bolts. They're 16mm. I'm using my breaker bar just because they're usually on tight. Just to loosen them, there we go. These weren't on that tight. There we go. So now they're loose. You can use a ratchet to remove them. Watch out because the brake disc might fall off when you pull this off. Here's the carrier. And there's the brake disc. Okay, now we're going to remove the handbrake hardware. It's held on by two sort of spring-loaded bolts here. They're 5mm. Basically, they just turn a bit and then they pop right out. One on the top, one on the bottom. Now this is fairly loose, but we need to use a pick to remove the springs, or get them loose from the shoes. There's a big one on this side. There we go, and then basically everything will just fall out. So there are the two shoes and the cable bracket. So you can just put those aside for now. Okay, before we get ready to push the half shaft out of the hub, you have to remove it from the differential. See if I can get there. Right there, that's where it was attached. And basically it's a CV joint, so you should be able to just pull it out. And I'm doing the driver's side, so I have it just resting on the exhaust here. And so now with that loose, we're ready to push the splines out of the hub. Okay, so this is the puller pusher that I'm going to use. It's going to push on the spline here. Notice I put the bolt back on just to prevent any damage to the threads. And the jaws are going to attach here and they're going to push it right out. Okay, I've got the puller installed, or pusher in this case. There it is right there. And I've got the socket on the end. and I've got a box and a milk crate because it's heavy, just to hold it up and hold it straight. So I'm just gonna start manually, and then if it gets really tight, then I'll you probably try the impact wrench, hit it with a hammer a couple times to see if I can get it loose. And then once it's loose, I'll back it off and take off the nut so I can push it all the way through. Okay, so I think it's moving now, so I'm gonna remove the pusher, take the bolt off, and keep pressing it out. Okay, so I've removed the nut on the hub, reinstalled the pusher, and now I'm just going to manually push it the rest of the way out. Okay, so now it's almost all the way through. Let's see if I can get in there. You can see it. Now I'm just gonna use my chisel just to punch it out the rest of the way, just tap it out. And that's it. So it's out. So there it is. That's the half shaft out. So the next step is to remove the hub from the bearing. So there's a video online of a guy with an E46 using a bearing separator like this, and he puts it behind there and then bolts it on, and then uses lug nuts to go through the holes to push it off. But I found it just didn't work. I tried with this bearing separator, it just pushed it onto the emergency brake, the shield, dust shield, and it just ended up bending, and it wouldn't come off that way. So the only way that I can see that they can get it off easily without damaging it or damaging anything else like this, or I mean, I'm gonna replace this, but the only way to get it off is to use a slide hammer. So that's what we're gonna do. Okay, I've got the slide hammer installed. So now we're going to use it to remove the hub from the bearing. So that's it. That removed the hub from the bearing. Notice that the outer bearing race is still on. That we're going to have to remove. So in order to get the outer race off the hub, I've installed a bearing separator, tighten the nuts, and I'm going to use the lug nuts to push the bearing separator down to remove the outer race. And once that's done, once it's up like half inch or so, a few millimeters, once I can get the jaws to this three arm puller on here on the race, then I'll pull the rest away with this. So I've used the bearing separator to move the race up just a bit so I could get the 3-jaw puller on it. And then I've got this little piece of steel here, and then I'm going to use the puller to pull that piece all the way up. So there we go. That's removed the old race from the hub, and if the hub's in good shape, we should be able to reuse it. So the next part is to remove the snap ring and then remove the bearing from the hub. Okay, now we have to remove the snap ring, which I have these big pliers. You can probably get away with smaller pliers, but that's what I have. So okay, so I've removed the snap ring. It's all rusty. So we're going to install a new one of those. And now we can push the old bearing out. Okay, so we've removed the ABS sensor, which was right in there where you can see that hole. And it's just a precaution, just to, when we push the bearing out, that we don't damage it. So that was it's a 5mm hex. Right down here. And then you just pry it out gently, and that's it. Okay, so in order to press the bearing out of the trailing arm, we're going to use one of these. It just fits on the inside of the race here, and that's going to press it out evenly. And then we're going to have this receiver cup on there, and that's going to be bolted in with this big bolt, and that's going to press. We're just going to slowly tighten it, and it'll press the bearing out. So the receiver cup's there, and you can't really see, but on the inside I've got an adjustable wrench here that's holding onto that big bolt, and then the cup's going to press the bearing out as I use my big adjustable wrench to tighten it. Okay, so that's it. Now we just have to loosen this, take it off, and the bearing will be out. There we go. So that's the old bearing out. So now have to clean everything up. It's pretty rusty, so we'll clean the inside of here with a wire wheel. I'm going to replace the backing plate because this one's rusted. New hardware for the backing plate, and then we'll start with the reinstallation. Okay, we're now ready to press the new bearing in. I've installed the new dust shield, and I've used a wire wheel to clean all the interior of the trailing arm where the bearing goes into. So we're going to press the bearing in. This is the new bearing. We're going to press it in with one of these plates it's exactly or almost exactly the same size as the bearing itself, so it'll support it on the outer race and push it in evenly. And then we've got a larger one on the back to support it while we push the bearing in. The bearing has a small little, I don't know if you can see that, a small little lip on it. That's the side that goes in towards the car, and it'll help it seal easier and help it go in straight. Okay, we're ready to press the bearing in. So you want to get the plate as straight as possible and the bearing as straight as possible, and make sure it's not going in crooked. And then start tightening it. I've got my other adjustable wrench here holding the back of the bolt. Okay, I had a lot of trouble getting the bearing in straight, so what I was using a small plate that was just the exact same size as the bearing, but the bearing kept going in like this or like this. So after some fiddling, I put this bigger plate on there, and then I'm just go one turn, hit it with the hammer to make sure it's all seating in there, and then you can do another turn. Okay, so the new bearing, I finished pushing it in. You have to push it in until you, basically until it stops. You can only go so far in pushing, and it hits the back of the trailing arm, and you can't go any further. So you'll know when you hit it. Okay, now we're going to put in the new retaining clip. I'm ready to press the hub back into the new bearing. I'm using a plate and the bearing pusher to compress the hub onto the new bearing. Make sure on the back that you have a plate that's supporting the inner race, because if you have like a big plate on the back, it'll push the hub in and then push the inner race out and destroy the bearing. I did that by accident on the other side. So make sure you're supporting the back with one of these plates that's small enough to fit inside and go up against the bearing. Okay, so now the hub is seated back in its place in the new bearing, and now we're ready to reinstall the half shaft, and that's going to go back in the hub. So we'll get started with that. Okay, so this is the half shaft, which you can see there's the bolts onto the differential right there, and it goes over there towards the hub and the bearing. So to get that back on, it's a pain in the butt, but you want to pry in between. Let's see if I can do it. You want to pry in between the differential and the half shaft gently, and you want to pry it in order to push it into the hub. The mistake I made, I don't know if you can see very well, the mistake I made on the other side is I used a screwdriver, if you can see that, and I tapped the half shaft from that area into the hub, which worked. But what happened is, if you can see this ring there, that's your ABS ring, and I actually knocked that off. It's not one piece, it's sort of like attached, but it's not like bolted on or anything. So what happens is, if you knock that off, the ABS sensor doesn't get a good signal, and causes your dash warning lights to come on, and it kind of screws everything up. So do not like tap there with a pry bar or anything, and obviously don't tap on try to pry it on the boots. That's what I originally thought I was going to do, but that'll tear the boot, and then all your grease will leak out, and you'll have to replace the boots. So like I said, pry gently here, put your pry bar in between those two pieces, and just gently like push it so it goes in until you can get the big nut on the half shaft. Okay, so I've reinstalled the caliper, the caliper carrier, brake disc, all the emergency brake hardware. So that's all back in. So now I'm going to tighten the 36mm bolt holding the half shaft into the hub. So once again, I've got a piece of my chisel in here to prevent it from moving, and then I'm just using my socket to slowly tighten the bolt. Okay, so the correct torque for this bolt is 221 foot-pounds, so I got my torque wrench set to 220. So there we go. Okay, so the last step was to hammer the, see if I can zoom in. It's to hammer the new bolt, the I don't know what the process is called, but basically just locking the bolt into the half shaft spline so it can't ever loosen, I suppose. Anyway, you hammer it with a chisel. I hammered it on this side and on the bottom. So the last part for me is to reinstall the sway bar and bolt the exhaust back up to the car, but that's just the same as the reversal of the removal process that I documented earlier in the video. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your repair.